It's just a tragedy. There's nothing more to be said. It was awful. It should never have happened.
The first thing they see is the blood. It's smeared across the cream-colored carpet in a wide, sticky pool, splattered up the side of the TV stand like someone threw paint against the wall. The second thing they see is the body. 24-year-old Greg Smart is lying face down in his own living room, shoes still on, keys still in his pocket, one arm twisted under him, the other reaching out like he was trying to grab something that wasn't there. There's a hole in the back of his head, not a messy spray from across the room, not some wild shot in a struggle, a close-range contact wound. The gun was pressed right against his skull when it went off. Execution style. The dog is going insane, circling the body, nails scratching at the floor, whimpering and barking like it's trying to wake him up. On the coffee table, there's a wedding photo. Greg in a suite, his wife beside him, smiling. Her name is Pamela Smart. Tonight, she's not in this room. She's not kneeling in the blood. She's not holding his hand while he dies. She's miles away, surrounded by teenagers, wearing a title that should make her one of the safest people in a child's life. High school media coordinator, Mrs. Smart. The teacher. When the first officers step into the condo, they're hit with that instant, metallic stench of fresh blood. They see the knocked-over TV, a few open drawers, a toppled lamp. It looks like a classic robbery gone wrong scene. But something feels off. The violence is too precise. One bullet, straight to the back of the head. No wild shots, no bullet holes in the walls, no signs of a real fight. This doesn't feel like a burglar who panicked. It feels like someone walked in here for one reason: put Greg Smart on his knees and blow his brains out. Then the phones start ringing. Tips come in. Whispers turn into statements. And the same two words keep popping up in almost every conversation. Mrs. Smart. Students talk. Staff talk. They don't describe a distant, professional teacher. They talk about Pamela like she's one of them. The young, pretty staff member who wants to be the cool adult. The woman who hangs around with the kids after hours. The one who seems a little too close to a particular 15-year-old boy. His name is Billy Flynn. He should be worried about algebra, part-time jobs, and band practice. Instead, detectives hear he's been sneaking out late at night, taking secret phone calls, getting into a car with a married woman from school, and coming back with stories that don't sound like mentoring. What started as a rumor, Pamela Smart is messing around with a student, mutates into something much darker when the boys finally crack under interrogation. Because they don't just talk about sex, they talk about murder. They say it wasn't their idea to kill Greg. They say it started with Pamela's voice in their heads, complaining about her husband, talking about money, talking about how a divorce would ruin her, telling a love-struck 15-year-old that she couldn't live the life she wanted as long as Greg was alive. To any rational adult, that's toxic manipulation. To a teenage boy in love with his teacher, that sounds like a mission. The plan, according to prosecutors, is simple and monstrous. Greg comes home. The boys jump him, make it look like a robbery. One shot. No witnesses. Pamela keeps the condo, the dogs, the insurance money, and her teenage lover. So, on that night, when Greg steps into his own living room, he doesn't meet a masked stranger. He meets kids from the high school his wife works at. They force him to his knees. Think about that for a second. This is not a bar fight, not a road rage incident. This is a man in his own home, on his own carpet, kneeling in front of high school students who go to class the next morning like nothing happened. One of them presses the gun into the back of Greg's head. There is no mercy. No pause. No, are you sure? Just one loud crack. His body hits the floor. The blood starts to spread. And somewhere, miles away, the woman who will stand in front of TV cameras and call herself a widow is about to be accused of planning the whole thing. When the truth finally spills out, this won't just be a cheating scandal. It will be the story of a teacher figure who allegedly seduced a 15-year-old boy, used him as her personal weapon, and turned a group of teenagers into a death squad for her husband. A classroom mentor, accused of writing a murder script and handing it to her students. Pamela Smart will become one of the most infamous women in American true crime, and she is only case one tonight. If you're still here after that opening, you're exactly the kind of viewer Crime Uncovered is for. Before we go any deeper into the rest of these 10 evil female teacher cases, hit like right now so this documentary gets pushed to more people who actually care about the full story, not just the headlines. Subscribe to Crime Uncovered and turn on the bell if you want more long, detailed, true crime breakdowns like this one. And I want to know something. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. I read them, and I want to see who's really sitting through these cases with me. Because if one trusted teacher can turn her students into killers, wait until you see what the other 9 were hiding behind their desks. The shot that killed Greg Smart wasn't fired in a dark alley. It was fired because of conversations that started in a school hallway. A woman with a staff badge, a teenager with a crush, a classroom that slowly turned into a hunting ground. And Pamela Smart is not the only one. You and I like to think we know what danger looks like. We picture strangers, masks, dark clothes, someone lurking outside the school fence. But tonight, every single threat we're talking about stood at the front of the class. They handed out assignments. They graded homework. They smiled at parents' evenings. And behind that, they were hiding crimes, obsessions, and in some cases, killings that would destroy the very lives they were trusted to protect. This is Crime Uncovered, and in this documentary we're diving into the most evil female teachers in history, the women whose classrooms became crime scenes. Some of them seduced children and called it love. Some of them groomed students for years in secret. Some of them brought guns onto campus and opened fire. All of them wore the same mask. Teacher, quick disclaimer. Everything you're going to hear tonight comes from court records, police reports, and reputable news sources. Most of these women have been convicted. Where a case is still working its way through appeals, or where there are disputed details, I will say, alleged, and you should treat it that way. Nothing here replaces a court of law. This is not gossip. This is a documented trail of what really happened when women in positions of trust crossed the line into abuse, manipulation, and murder. Tonight's 10 teachers. Across the rest of this video, we're going case by case through 10 of the most disturbing female teacher stories ever recorded. 1. Pamela Smart, the high school media coordinator, who, prosecutors say, seduced a 15-year-old student and turned him into the trigger man in her husband's execution. 2. Mary Kay Letourneau, the married elementary school teacher whose illegal relationship with her 12-year-old student shocked the world, landed her in prison, and then turned into one of the strangest love stories ever told. 3. Brittany Zamora, the 6th grade teacher who didn't just cross the line with a 13-year-old student, she stepped over it again and again in classrooms, in cars, even during school hours. 4. Deborah LaFave, the Florida middle school teacher whose abuse of a 14-year-old student raised a brutal question. Did her appearance, and the media's obsession with it, help her escape the kind of sentence anyone else would have received? 5. Christine McCallum, a Massachusetts teacher who groomed a boy from the age of 13 and went on to have hundreds of sexual encounters with him, all while his family trusted her. 6. Candice Barber, a UK teaching assistant who sent explicit photos to a 15-year-old pupil, had sex with him, and then tried to intimidate him into keeping quiet. 7. Erin McLean, a Tennessee student teacher whose affair with an 18-year-old student lit the fuse on a deadly triangle that ended with the student shot dead outside the family home. 8. Jennifer Fichter, the English teacher who juggled multiple students at once, driving around late at night for secret meetings that would eventually add up to dozens of criminal charges. 9. Laurie Dan, a disturbed former babysitter and school helper who walked into an elementary classroom with a gun and turned a 2nd grade lesson into a shooting. 10. Amy Bishop, the university biology professor who brought a handgun to a faculty meeting and opened fire on her colleagues, turning an academic conference room into a killing floor. By the time we're done, you will never look at the phrase. She was just a teacher, the same way again. Talk to me. Where are you watching from? Before we dive into the next case, I want to know something. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. I read them, and I want to see who is really here with me, this deep into these cases. Is it 3 a.m. on your phone, with headphones in? Are you watching this on your TV while everyone else is asleep? Tell me, if you've made it this far, you're not here for short clips and shock thumbnails. You're here for full stories. So, before we move on, tap like right now. It tells the algorithm people actually want long, detailed true crime documentaries. Subscribe to Crime Uncovered and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. We've started with an execution planned in a high school media office. Next, we're going into a case so infamous that her name alone became shorthand for teacher scandal. A woman who said she loved her 12-year-old student so much she was willing to go to prison for him. Pamela Wojas Smart was 22 when she walked into Winnacunnet High School. She wasn't the tired, burned-out veteran teacher students roll their eyes at. She was young, blonde, ambitious, and she wanted the kids to like her. Her job title sounded harmless: Media Services Director, the person who helped with cameras, school news, video projects. To the teenagers in that building, she felt less like a strict authority figure and more like the cool older sister who just happened to have an office on campus. That was the problem. She blurred the line on purpose. Students drifted into her office just to talk. She laughed at their jokes, played their music, let them vent about parents and teachers. To most kids, it felt harmless. To one boy in particular, it felt like something else. His name was Billy Flynn, 15 years old, long hair, obsessed with heavy metal and guitars, the kind of kid who didn't get much power in his everyday life. Pam noticed him. It didn't start with a kiss. It started with attention. Extra time in her office, private conversations after class, late-night phone calls where she complained about her life at home, about how her husband Greg didn't understand her, about how trapped she felt in her marriage. An adult hears that and recognizes emotional manipulation. A 15-year-old boy hears it and thinks, she trusts me, she needs me, I matter. The slide from boundaries to abuse was slow, but it was steady. After-school chats turned into rides in her car. Rides turned into parked car meetings. Names turned from Mrs. Smart and Flynn into Pam and Billy. According to his testimony, she told him she loved him, and then she crossed the final line. They began a sexual relationship. People like to call it an affair. It wasn't. It was rape. She was an adult in a position of authority. He was a minor who could not legally consent. But in Billy's mind, he believed he was the man in her life, the secret partner, the one who would save her. That's when Greg Smart stopped being just a husband in the background and started being an obstacle. Billy says Pam talked constantly about how unhappy she was, how Greg held her back, how a divorce would ruin her financially, how she would lose the condo, the dogs, the life she liked living. She painted herself as a victim, trapped and helpless. There was, she hinted, only one way out that didn't cost her everything. If Greg died in a robbery, she kept the money, she kept the home, she kept the dogs, and she kept the boy who thought he was her hero. To a rational adult, that sounds insane. To a 15-year-old who thinks he is in love with his teacher, it sounds like a mission. Billy doesn't keep it to himself. He starts talking to his friends, other teenage boys, kids who should have been worried about band practice and detention, not guns and alibis. They talk about stealing a revolver. They talk about how to get into the condo. They talk about making it look like a burglary gone wrong. And, according to what they later tell police, Pamela keeps feeding the fire. She doesn't have to say, "Go kill my husband," in one clear sentence. She just has to repeat the same message. If Greg is alive, she loses everything. If Greg dies in a robbery, she gets to have it all without consequence. On the 1st of May, 1990, Greg walks into his home as usual. The teenagers are waiting. By the time he realizes anything is wrong, he's already on his knees. One of those boys raises the gun, presses it to the back of Greg's head, and pulls the trigger. The rest topple furniture, yank drawers, smash a television. They leave him face down on his own carpet and walk back out into the night. For a short while, the lie holds. Police talk about a possible break-in. The widow gives interviews. She cries on camera. She swears she wants justice. But secrets like this don't last in a high school. The boys start bragging to girlfriends and friends. The affair between Pam and Billy becomes harder to hide. The rumors reach detectives. Phone records are pulled. Students are questioned. Hidden recordings are made. One by one, the teenagers break in interrogation rooms. They tell the same story. Yes, they pulled the trigger. Yes, they went into the condo. But in their version, the idea, the motive, the pressure, all trace back to the woman at the front of the classroom. They say she seduced a child, wrapped him around her finger, and then used him to get rid of her husband. The trial that follows turns into one of the first gavel-to-gavel televised court cases in American history. Millions of people watch Billy Flynn take the stand and describe how his teacher became his lover, and then his handler. They hear secret recordings where Pamela seems far more worried about herself than about Greg. The prosecution paints her as a cold manipulator, a sexual predator, a mastermind who never needed to touch the gun to make a murder happen. The defense calls the boys liars. They say the kids acted on their own and dragged Pamela down to save themselves. The jury doesn't believe it. Pamela Smart is convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, accomplice to first-degree murder, witness tampering, and insurance fraud. She is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She did not fire the shot that killed Greg Smart. She never set foot inside the condo on the night he died. But the court decided that without her, none of it would have happened. A woman in her early 20s, a staff badge, an office in a high school, and a group of teenagers who turned into killers because a teacher showed them how far she was willing to go. Pamela Smart was the first evil teacher on our list. She won't be the last. Mary Catherine Letourneau was the kind of teacher parents thought they could trust. Married, a mother of 4, a devout Catholic schoolgirl turned elementary school teacher in Washington State. On paper, she was the picture of a respectable adult, the woman you're relieved to see at the front of your child's classroom. Her student was a 12-year-old boy named Vili Fualau. He was quiet, shy, an artistic kid from an unstable background who drew pictures that caught her attention. She told him he was talented. She told him he was special. She gave him something he wasn't getting anywhere else: focused, adult praise. It started, like it so often does, with extra time together that looked harmless. She helped him with assignments. She let him stay after class. She allowed a 12-year-old to slowly step into her adult life, far beyond the classroom door. Soon, she was calling his house, talking to his family, positioning herself not just as his teacher, but as his mentor, his advocate, his trusted adult. She was in her 30s. He was in 6th grade. The power difference was enormous, but she didn't pull back. She leaned in. The boundaries dissolved. A ride home became a detour. A private talk became something more. The woman Vili should have been able to run to for protection was the person he needed protection from. By the time his 13th birthday approached, the relationship had crossed the line completely. She didn't simply fail to stop it. She initiated it. This was not a teenage crush getting out of hand. It was a grown woman, a wife and mother, deliberately turning a child into her secret partner. At school, she was still Mrs. Letourneau. To the outside world, she was still a teacher, still a mother, still a supposed role model. Behind the scenes, she was sneaking away with a 12-year-old boy she was supposed to be grading, not touching. When people began to notice how often they were together, she brushed it off. She insisted she was just helping a struggling child. But it's hard to hide something this twisted forever. The first crack came when the police were called to find out why a car was parked in a darkened lot after hours. In that car, they found Mary Kay Letourneau and her student. The explanation she gave didn't hold. Word got back to the school. Word got back to her husband. The rumors hardened into suspicion. And then the suspicion hardened into something undeniable. Because by the time the truth surfaced, it wasn't just an inappropriate relationship. Mary Kay Letourneau was pregnant. At 34 years old, she was carrying the child of her 12-year-old student. The layers of betrayal are almost impossible to stack in one mind. A mother of 4, a wife, a teacher, an adult, trusted by that boy's own family. And the evidence, growing inside her, proved exactly how far she had gone. Her husband's world exploded. Her community's illusions shattered. The justice system finally stepped in. She was arrested and charged with child rape. There was no way to spin a pregnancy like that as anything other than what it was, the product of sexual abuse. In court, she didn't face a story of star-crossed lovers. She faced the brutal reality of what she had done, taken a child and wrapped him in a fantasy he could never have consented to. The plea deal came with conditions. She would admit guilt. She would go to jail. She would be ordered to stay away from him. No contact, no more private meetings, no more phone calls, no more crossing his path. But Mary Kay Letourneau refused to let go. Even behind bars, she clung to the idea that this wasn't a crime. It was love. When she got a brief window of freedom, she broke the no-contact order almost immediately. She met with him again. Once more, she became pregnant. By now, the word teacher in her story had twisted into something grotesque. The title she used to open a classroom door became the same title she hid behind, while dragging a child into adult situations he could never walk away from without being branded. Instead of re-entering society and rebuilding as a woman who had accepted responsibility, she doubled down. She insisted to the world that she and this former student were meant to be together. The courts disagreed. She was sent back to prison, this time for years, as the story went international. Her name became shorthand for a female teacher who had done the unthinkable. When she finally walked out again, it wasn't into anonymity. It was into a world that had watched her destroy her career, her marriage, and her reputation, all while insisting that she was following her heart. The most chilling part? In the end, the boy she'd abused, the child she first met as a 12-year-old in her classroom, would be the man standing beside her in wedding photos. The marriage didn't rewrite the past. It didn't erase the power imbalance or the years of grooming. It just proved how deep her hold on him had gone. Mary Kay Letourneau didn't just fail as a teacher. She took the trust that comes with that word and twisted it into something so dark that her name still sits at the top of almost every list of evil female educators. A woman in her 30s, a 12-year-old boy, 2 pregnancies, a scandal that forced people to look at an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes, the predator in the classroom is not the man people are scanning for. It's the smiling woman at the front of the room. Brittany Zamora was the kind of teacher parents thought their kids were lucky to have. Young, enthusiastic, smiling in photos. The sort of 6th grade teacher who decorated her classroom, talked about potential, and posted motivational quotes. Her students called her nice. Her colleagues called her energetic. The school called her an asset. What nobody knew was that behind that bright, polished surface, she was messaging a 13-year-old boy in her class like he was her boyfriend. It started with compliments. "You're so mature for your age. You're one of my favorites. I can talk to you more than other students." To a 13-year-old, that hits hard. You're not just another kid in a boring classroom anymore. You're different, special, chosen. Then the messages got longer. She wasn't just talking about homework. She was talking about feelings, about how she liked him, about how she couldn't stop thinking about him. The language shifted slowly from teacher and student to you and me. By the time anyone else had a clue, the way Brittany Zamora was talking to this boy had crossed a line so far it was barely even visible in the rearview mirror. She started sending him messages that no adult should ever send a child. She told him she wanted him. She told him she couldn't wait to be alone with him. She told him to keep it secret. She wasn't just breaking rules. She was building a private world with a 13-year-old as her co-conspirator. The abuse didn't stay on a screen. She used the access her job gave her. Classroom time, after-school duties, moments before and after the bell. She found ways to get this boy alone. In an empty classroom, when the room should have belonged to every child in that grade, she turned it into their hiding place. The same space where he learned fractions and grammar became the place she crossed into contact that could never be excused. It didn't happen once. It happened again and again. In her car, during school events, even in the short gaps when every other adult assumed they're safe, they're with a teacher. Each time, she reinforced the same message. This was their secret. This was special. No one would understand. He was 13. In his eyes, this wasn't abuse yet. It was the most intense, confusing rush of his life. He didn't have the language to name what was being done to him. She did, and she kept going anyway. On the surface, nothing looked wrong. Brittany smiled in class pictures. She stood beside bulletin boards covered in student work. Parents shook her hand on conference night. None of them knew that while they were thanking her for teaching their kids, she was turning one of those kids into her private obsession. The first crack in her control didn't come from a teacher. It didn't come from a principal. It came from technology. The boy's parents noticed their son acting differently, hiding his phone, guarding his messages, glued to the screen at all hours. They installed a monitoring app. What they found in his message history wasn't teenage flirting. It was an adult teacher pouring explicit fantasies and promises into their son's head. The tone was undeniable. The content was explicit. The names and times tied it directly back to her. The parents didn't go to the school first. They went straight to the police. From that moment, the mask Brittany Zamora had been wearing as the favorite teacher began to crack. Detectives moved in quietly. They looked at the messages. They saw where she had arranged meetups, where she had apologized for not being able to get alone with him more often, where she had described what she wanted to do to him in graphic detail. There was no innocent way to explain it. When they dug deeper, they found more. They learned about abuse in her classroom, about encounters in her car, about times she had used her position to slip this boy away from watchful eyes. The story that emerged was not a momentary lapse. It was a pattern of grooming, a pattern of manipulation, a pattern of putting her desire above a child's safety. In the end, Brittany Zamora stood not as the inspiring young teacher parents thought they were getting, but as a defendant facing multiple counts of sexual conduct with a minor, exploitation, and public sexual indecency. In court, the evidence spoke louder than any apology. The messages, the timeline, the sheer number of encounters. She pled guilty. The judge handed down a sentence measured in decades, not months. The same woman who had stood at the front of a sixth-grade classroom telling children to believe in their dreams was now standing in a prison uniform, hearing how long she would be locked away. For her victim, there is no clean ending. He will always remember the person who was supposed to be safe, the person his parents trusted, the person who turned their authority into a weapon. On paper, Brittany Zamora was exactly what schools say they want: engaged, youthful, passionate. In reality, she was another name on a growing list of female teachers who used the classroom not as a place to protect children, but as a place to find them. Deborah Lefebvre looked like the last person anyone expected to see in a mugshot. Blonde, young, conventionally attractive. She had that polished, Florida suburban look you'd expect from a teacher in a yearbook photo, not from a defendant accused of sexual crimes. She taught middle school in Florida, English and reading, the kind of teacher students joked about having a crush on, the kind of teacher other women might privately roll their eyes at, but no one labeled as dangerous. Her victim was a 14-year-old boy. The relationship began the way so many of these stories do, with extra attention. She started singling him out, talking to him after class, making him feel older than he was. She told him she understood him in ways other people didn't. She let conversations drift away from homework and grades and into personal territory. She called him, texted him, built a secret channel where the two of them could talk without anyone else seeing. Then she crossed the line. She invited him into her car, into empty spaces where no one else was around. She initiated physical contact that no child in her care was prepared to process. A woman in her 20s, married, in charge of a classroom, treating a 14-year-old like a partner instead of a student. It didn't stop at a kiss. It escalated fast. She wasn't meeting him once. She was arranging encounters over and over again, in her car, at his house, when no one else was home, sometimes with a friend present in the next room, trying to pretend this was normal. The abuse was deliberate and sustained. Every time she touched him, she reinforced the same message. This is special. This is between us. No one else would understand. To the outside world, Deborah Lefebvre was still the pretty teacher, with the perfect hair and the nice clothes. She still walked into school, smiled at colleagues, marked papers. She still played the role of responsible adult in front of dozens of other children. No one looking at her from the front of a classroom knew that she had already crossed almost every boundary a school enforces. The truth didn't crack open because she confessed. It cracked because other people started to notice the boy's behavior and the strange way his teacher hovered around him. Questions started to form. Stories began to spread. The boy's mother started putting pieces together. Eventually, the accusations reached the police. When detectives sat down with the boy and started asking direct questions, the reality tumbled out. He described what had been going on, the meetings, the sexual acts, the places they happened, the way his teacher had come into his life and turned it upside down. Deborah was arrested and charged with multiple counts of lewd and lascivious battery on a minor. This is where her case turned into something even darker, not because of the abuse, but because of how the world reacted to it. Photos of Deborah Lefebvre flew across the media. Her appearance became the story. Headlines focused on how beautiful she was. Panel shows asked whether a boy could really be a victim when the abuser looked like her. It was as if people forgot what the charges actually were. A grown woman using her authority and age to sexually exploit a child. Her defense team leaned into that angle. They talked about her mental health, her anxiety, how the prison system would be too harsh and dangerous because of how she looked. There were arguments made in court that a conventional prison sentence would be uniquely hard on her. A boy had lost his innocence. His childhood had been rewritten. His relationship with adults, especially women in positions of power, would never be the same. And the conversation somehow tilted to whether it was too harsh to send her to prison. Eventually, a plea deal was reached. She did not receive the kind of lengthy prison term most people imagine when they hear multiple counts of sexual abuse on a minor. She received a combination of house arrest and probation, along with registration as a sex offender. The disparity became part of the story. Would a male teacher in his 20s, attractive or not, have walked away without years behind bars for the same acts with a 14-year-old girl? Most people already knew the answer. The lesson in Deborah Lefebvre's case isn't just that a seemingly perfect teacher can be a predator. It's that when the predator is a woman who fits a certain image, the public conversation twists. People joked, they minimized, they asked the wrong questions, they focused on her looks instead of his trauma. But strip away the headlines, the photographs, and the spin, and what's left is simple. A child trusted his teacher. She chose to use that trust for her own gratification. She crossed every line, then walked into a courtroom and benefited from a system that couldn't stop staring at her face. On paper, Deborah Lefebvre was a young, beautiful English teacher. In reality, she was another reminder that evil teacher doesn't always look like the stereotype in people's heads. Sometimes, she looks exactly like the person parents are relieved to see at the front of the class. By the time anyone realized what Christine McCallum had done, the number was already sickening. Not once, not twice, hundreds of times. She wasn't a stranger in a dark alley. She was a teacher in Massachusetts, and the boy she chose was just 13. He met her the way most kids meet adults who later hurt them, through trust. Christine worked with children. She had that calm, reassuring presence that makes parents relax. She talked about helping students, about making a difference. On the surface, she looked like every other dedicated educator. The victim's family let her in. She helped him with schoolwork. She offered extra support. She seemed to genuinely care about him. She became a regular, acceptable adult in his life. That was the trap. At first, the contact seemed harmless. A ride here, a chat there, a supportive message. Small moments that looked like kindness from the outside. Behind the scenes, she was testing the boundaries. A touch on the shoulder that lingered a little too long. Personal questions that dug deeper than they should. Conversations that edged away from school and into his insecurities, his home life, his loneliness. Step by step, she positioned herself as the one adult who truly understood him. Then, when she knew he trusted her completely, she crossed the line. The first sexual encounter happened when he was barely a teenager. A boy who should have been awkward, embarrassed, nervous around girls his own age, suddenly thrown into physical contact with a grown woman he had been taught to respect. He didn't have the language or power to stop it. She did. She kept going anyway. The story didn't end with a single moment of abuse. It became a pattern, a routine, a new, twisted normal. Again in her home, again in his home, again in cars, again in places where she knew they wouldn't be disturbed. He was still expected to call her Miss McCallum in any setting where other people could hear. To the outside world, she remained the teacher, the helper, the adult. Behind closed doors, she was treating a 13-year-old as her secret partner. The number of encounters kept rising. Dozens, then more. By the time investigators finally sat down and tried to count, they stopped dealing in single digits and started talking in triple digits. Over and over and over. For years. She took advantage of the same child, while everyone around her believed she was doing the opposite, protecting and teaching him. He tried to carry it. He tried to live with it. But a boy that age cannot absorb that kind of secret forever without cracking. Eventually, he confided in someone. The truth came out in pieces, then in full. When the authorities got involved, the scale of what Christine had done stunned even experienced investigators. This wasn't a fling. It wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated campaign of grooming and exploitation. She had kept a journal, notes, details, evidence that tied her directly to the abuse. When it all came into court, She stood in front of a judge, not as a misunderstood woman in love, but as an adult who had systematically broken down a child's defenses and used him for her own gratification hundreds of times. She ultimately pled guilty to a long list of charges, including multiple counts of child rape. The sentence that followed measured her crimes out in years. For her victim, there will never be enough years to equal the impact. He will always remember that the person who did this to him wasn't some faceless predator. She was a teacher, someone his family let into their home, someone who sat at their table and smiled while hiding what she was doing to their son. Christine McCallum's case is one of the clearest examples of how predatory a nice teacher can be. Not a single moment of madness. A long, cold, methodical pattern of abuse, committed by a woman everyone thought they could trust with children. If you're still with me halfway through this documentary, you're exactly the kind of viewer Crime Uncovered is built for. We've covered some of the darkest cases of teacher abuse, and there are 5 more to go, including 2 that end not in secret affairs, but in gunfire. Take a second right now to hit like if you haven't already. It tells YouTube that people want full-length, unfiltered investigations like this, not just short clips. And make sure you're subscribed to Crime Uncovered with notifications turned on so you don't miss the next deep dive. Where are you right now in this video? Still watching? Drop a comment and let me know you made it this far. Now let's continue. In Buckinghamshire, England, a teenage boy's phone started lighting up with messages from someone he should never have seen in that notification bar. His teaching assistant. Her name was Candice Barber. On school grounds, she was just another adult in a classroom. Young, presentable, married. The kind of staff member parents barely register because nothing about her looks alarming. But behind a screen, late at night, she was sending a 15-year-old pupil messages no adult should ever send a child. It started like so many of these cases do. Compliments, jokes, the kind of messages that blur the line between teacher and friend. She told him he was good-looking. She told him he was different from the other boys. She made him feel seen in a way that felt exciting instead of wrong. Then the texts got bolder. She sent him a photo, not a selfie from the staff room, an explicit picture. A married teaching assistant sending a nude image to a boy who was still legally a child. Receipts don't lie. The image stayed on his phone, proof of how far she was already willing to go. Once that barrier was broken, the messaging escalated. Flirting turned into sexual talk. Sexual talk turned into arranging to meet outside school. She used the one thing she knew teenagers crave most attention and twisted it into a hook. When they finally met up in person away from classrooms and corridors, she wasn't checking on his homework. According to the court's findings, she had sex with him in fields, in cars, in places where 2 adults might hide an affair. Only one of them was an adult. The other was a 15-year-old student who still had to see her at school and pretend nothing was happening. In the light of day, Candice went back to work like normal. She walked past him in halls. She stood in classrooms. She played the role of responsible staff member under the same roof where she had already crossed every line with one of the boys she was hired to help. The boy, like so many victims, wrestled with a mix of emotions he was too young to untangle. On one hand, the thrill, the secrecy, the sense of being chosen. On the other, confusion, guilt, and a creeping sense that this wasn't something he could ever talk about without being blamed. He did talk. He told friends. He shared what was happening. He showed the photos. Teenagers gossip. Screenshots travel. And once a secret like that starts to leak, it moves faster than any adult can control. Eventually, the truth landed where it needed to, with adults who understood exactly how wrong this was. Police got involved. Phones were seized. Chats were recovered. The explicit photos she had sent came back to haunt her as hard evidence. In court, Candice Barber tried to deny it. She claimed the boy was lying. She said nothing had ever happened. She painted herself as the victim of a teenager's fantasy. The problem was the digital trail, the images, the messages, the metadata. The jury saw enough. She was convicted of causing or inciting a child to engage in sexual activity, sexual communication with a child, and causing a child to watch a sexual act. Later, after retrial, the case against her became even clearer. The judge's words were sharp. He spoke about abuse of trust, about a boy whose introduction to adult sexuality had been through exploitation, about a married teaching assistant who ignored her duty of care and pursued a child instead. She was sentenced to time in prison. Behind bars, the reality stripped away any remaining illusion. She wasn't just the attractive TA anymore. She wasn't the fun one in class. She was a convicted child sex offender. For the boy, the damage doesn't end when her sentence does. He will always remember the messages, the photo that should never have landed on his phone, the way she stood at the front of the room and pretended nothing had happened while he carried the weight of knowing exactly what she'd done. Candice Barber's case stretches across an ocean from the American stories, but the pattern is the same. A female educator, protected by the assumption that women aren't like that, quietly proving that assumption wrong. One message, one photo, one encounter at a time. Some evil teacher stories end inside the classroom. Erin McLean's doesn't. It ends outside a family home, with an 18-year-old lying in his car, bleeding from a gunshot wound. Erin was a student teacher and counselor in Knoxville, Tennessee, married, 2 children. On the surface, a normal young family trying to hold everything together. Her husband's name was Eric McLean. He worked hard, supported the family, and trusted that while he was out, his wife was doing what student teachers are supposed to do, learning how to help kids, not hurting them. At school, Erin met a student named Sean Powell. He was 18 years old, unstable, adrift, the kind of young man a caring mentor might try to save. She didn't just try to help him. She crossed the line. Erin started spending too much time with Sean, talking to him outside class, letting him into her personal life. The relationship turned sexual. A married student teacher, an 18-year-old student, 2 small children at home, while their mother wrapped herself up in a secret with a young man from her school. Erin didn't keep him at arm's length from her family life, the way you'd expect from a guilty conscience. Sean was around the house, in their space, close enough that Eric could see the lines blurring, even if he didn't know every detail. Imagine being that husband. You notice the late-night calls, the way your wife looks at this young man, the way he looks at her. You feel the sickness in your gut, but you're told you're overreacting, that you're paranoid, that she's just trying to help a troubled student. All the while, the emotional and physical connection between Erin and Sean is getting stronger, not weaker. The tension in that house coiled tighter and tighter. On the 10th of March 2007, it snapped. Sean came to the McLean home in his Mercedes. He was outside with Erin, part of that tangled triangle that had been allowed to grow far too long. Eric confronted him. For months, anger and humiliation and fear had been building inside him. Now, the young man he believed had invaded his marriage was right there, outside his house, tied to everything falling apart in his life. The confrontation escalated. Eric went back inside, grabbed a rifle, and came out again. Outside the McLean home, under an ordinary sky, the situation turned deadly. He raised the weapon and fired into Sean's car. Sean Powell, the 18-year-old who had fallen into an affair with his student teacher, was hit. He died from his injuries while neighbors watched the blue lights and sirens flood a street that had looked normal moments earlier. The police arrested Eric McLean. He would later be convicted of reckless homicide and served only 47 days in jail, a sentence that shocked many who followed the case. The 18-year-old who pulled no trigger was the one who ended up dead, and at the center of it all was a student teacher. Erin McLean didn't fire the shot. She didn't pull the trigger that killed Sean Powell, but her choices built the triangle that collapsed that day. A married woman in training to become a teacher who took a student into her arms, an 18-year-old who believed her attention meant something it never should have, a husband whose life imploded when he discovered what had been happening under his own roof. Take Erin out of the equation, and Sean is just another young man trying to figure out his life. Eric is just another stressed husband trying to support his family. Put her affair back in, and you get exactly what we saw. An 18-year-old dead outside a home, a husband with a criminal record, and another word teacher dragged through a story it was never meant to be part of. Not one boy, not one affair, dozens of encounters, multiple students. Victor was an English teacher in Florida, mid-20s, attractive, friendly, the type of teacher students joked about, the one some parents might casually call too close, but never label as dangerous. Her victims were teenage boys from her own classes. At first, it was just one. She started how all of this starts, with attention that didn't look like a crime. She told him he was smart, that she saw potential in him, that he was different from the other kids. Then the texts started. Late at night. Longer, more personal. Not about homework, but about feelings, loneliness, how misunderstood she was. Soon she was sending things no teacher should ever send a student. Flirty messages. Then explicit messages. Then invitations. She met him in her car, in empty parking lots, in places where two adults might hide an affair. Only one of them was an adult. He was 17, legally still a child, emotionally nowhere near prepared to understand how badly she was crossing the line. She made him feel chosen. She made him feel powerful. She told him their connection was special, that nobody else would understand it. That's how grooming works. If the story ended there, it would already be horrifying. It didn't end there. Another boy, then another. She repeated the pattern. Compliments, late-night messages, secret meetings. She drove through the night to meet them. She risked her job, her freedom, and most importantly, their safety, over and over again. These weren't one-off mistakes. They were repeated decisions. Each new student was another secret to hide, another set of lies to juggle, another teenage boy who thought he was the only one. On the surface, she was still Miss Victor, the English teacher, smiling, teaching, grading, essays. In reality, she was leading a double life. One side in front of the class, one side in dark parking lots at midnight with students who should have been home asleep. Eventually, the weight of all those secrets became too much for her victims to carry. One boy told his mother. The words came out choked, awkward, ashamed. She listened. She believed him. And she went straight to the authorities. When police began investigating, they didn't just find a single inappropriate text. They uncovered a web. Messages that confirmed her intent. Details that matched boys' stories. Patterns that proved this wasn't just an isolated slip. Investigators uncovered encounter after encounter. On back roads, in parking lots, during nights when parents thought their sons were safe. The more they found, the worse it got. She hadn't just abused her authority with one vulnerable student. She had turned her classroom into a hunting ground. When the case finally hit court, the number that stuck with people was staggering. Dozens of counts of unlawful sexual activity with minors. Her attempts to apologize couldn't erase what she had done. She spoke of being broken, of being out of control, of making mistakes she couldn't undo. But those mistakes had faces. They had names. They had families sitting in that courtroom, wondering how a woman they trusted with their son's education had betrayed them so completely. The judge didn't just look at one victim. He saw a pattern of predation. He handed down a sentence measured in decades. For the boys, there was no plea deal. They got life with the memory of sneaking out at night to meet their teacher, the memory of seeing her by the whiteboard in the morning, pretending nothing had happened, the memory of realizing they hadn't been unique at all, they had been part of a chain. Jennifer Fichte's case forces a brutal question. How many times can a teacher cross that line before someone notices? In her case, the answer was far too many. A car, a phone, a classroom. Those were her tools. She didn't need a weapon to ruin lives. All she needed was access, opportunity, and a willingness to use teenage boys as if they existed to serve her needs. Another woman at the front of the room, another set of boys who will never look at the word teacher the same way again. Some of the women in this video used their authority to get children alone. Lori Dan brought her violence right into the classroom. Before she was a headline, she was just Lori, a young woman from a wealthy Chicago area family. She worked as a babysitter. She had done some work in schools. Parents saw her as another safe pair of hands, another smiling face in the orbit of their children. Behind that, things were already off. She had a history of disturbing behavior, obsession, strange habits, stalking, fires, poisoned food left for people who had crossed her. But those red flags floated in different corners of her life, never quite pulling together in time for someone to say the one word that mattered most. Stop. On the 20th of May 1988, in Winnetka, Illinois, all of those scattered warning signs finally converged. Lori woke up that morning with a plan. Not to groom a child, not to send texts or flirt, to hurt as many people as she could. She loaded a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. She gathered poison and flammable liquids. She prepared for a day that would end with sirens and body bags. First, she targeted people in their homes, leaving poisoned food and drink for those she believed had wronged her. dropping off packages that looked like gifts and tasted like murder attempts. But the most horrifying part of her plan was reserved for children. She walked into Hubbard Woods Elementary School, a place parents had sent their kids that morning believing they were safe. Little desks, crayon drawings on the walls, books and posters, and the hum of a normal school day. Lori Dan walked through those doors with a gun. She went into a second-grade classroom. No one was expecting it. 8-year-olds sat at their desks, close enough to touch. Their biggest fear that morning should have been a spelling test or a scraped knee. Instead, they watched a woman walk in and pull out a handgun. For a moment, no one understood what was about to happen. Then she started shooting. The sound of gunfire in a room built for children is wrong on a level that's hard to describe. She fired at close range into a cluster of small bodies. Kids screamed. Desks overturned. The panic filled every inch of that space. One boy, Nick Corwin, 8 years old, was shot and killed. Others were hit. Blood on clothes. Blood on the floor. Tiny bodies trying to understand pain they'd never felt before. In seconds, a cheerful classroom became a crime scene. Lori left the school, leaving behind injuries and a dead child. But she wasn't finished. She forced her way into a nearby house. She took a college student hostage. She held him at gunpoint in a bedroom while police surrounded the area, negotiators trying to make contact. Hours of fear, hours of tension. The boy she held could hear her shifting, ranting, moving with the gun. He had no idea how his day had led here, from ordinary to a life-and-death standoff with a woman who had just shot children. Eventually, Lori released him unharmed. It was the only mercy she showed anyone that day. Then, as the police closed in and the walls of the house became a cage, she turned the gun on herself and pulled the trigger. Lori Dan died by suicide before a judge could sentence her, before a jury could say guilty, before any of the parents whose lives she shattered could look her in the eye and tell her what she'd taken. There would be no prison years for her, no interviews, no appeals, just a trail. Poisoned food, burned homes, traumatized children, one dead 8-year-old, and a community that would never be the same. The horror of her case is that it rips away the comforting idea that we'll see it coming. Lori wasn't a stranger lurking at the fence. She was someone families had let inside, someone allowed to work with kids, someone people trusted with babysitting, with classroom help, with proximity to the most vulnerable. There were signs, but they were ignored, minimized, spread out over time. When she finally acted, she didn't need months of manipulation or secret texts. She needed one gun, one school, and a willingness to step through a door and pull the trigger. A second-grade classroom. Children barely tall enough to reach the whiteboard. A woman who walked in and turned a place of safety into a place of terror in seconds. Lori Dan is different from the others in one huge way. She didn't try to hide what she was. She brought her evil to the surface, in broad daylight, where every parent's worst nightmare could see it unfold. And by the end of that day, there was another small body in a child-sized casket, because the person the adults trusted to help with children had come to kill them instead. Most of the women we've talked about so far hid their crimes in shadows. Empty classrooms, cars, at night, private messages no one else was supposed to see. Amy Bishop didn't hide. She walked into a meeting room at a university, sat down with her colleagues, and then started shooting. Bishop was a biology professor at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, highly educated, PhD, married with children. To students, she was Dr. Bishop, the woman in the lab coat explaining complex systems of life. Underneath that title, she was furious. She believed the university had wronged her. Her bid for tenure had been denied. She thought she deserved a permanent position and the security that came with it. When it didn't happen, the anger didn't leave. It fermented. Co-workers saw flashes of her volatility, outbursts, strange behavior, a sense that something inside her was off. But academia is full of intense personalities. A bad temper doesn't automatically register as a warning sign of mass violence. On the 12th of February 2010, her colleagues gathered in a small conference room for a routine biology department meeting. It was the kind of room where people argue over budgets, schedules, and lab space. Fluorescent lights, a long table, nameplates, handouts. Amy Bishop sat with the others at that table. For about 40 minutes, everything looked ordinary. Then she stood up, pulled out a 9mm handgun, and began firing. No warning, no shouted threats, just the sudden mechanical rhythm of shots in a confined space. She aimed at point-blank range. One professor after another was hit. Some died instantly. Some slumped to the floor, gasping. Chaos erupted in the room, shouts overturned chairs, bodies scrambling for cover that didn't exist. In a matter of seconds, 3 of her colleagues lay dead. Dr. Gopi Pudila, Dr. Maria Raglan Davis, Dr. Adriel Johnson. 3 more were injured. People who had walked into that room thinking about research and teaching loads were now bleeding on a conference room carpet, surrounded by scattered papers and coffee cups. This wasn't a random attack on nameless strangers. These were co-workers, people she had chatted with in hallways, people she sat beside at other meetings. When the gun jammed, the massacre could have gotten even worse, or it could end. She tried to fire again. The mechanism failed. While some survivors scrambled to escape and call for help, Bishop walked out of the building as if leaving any other meeting. She tried to get away. Police stopped her a short distance from campus. She claimed it wasn't her, that she didn't remember what happened, that she hadn't done anything. The crime scene said otherwise. The survivors said otherwise. There was no question about whether she had pulled the trigger. In the weeks after the shooting, people started digging into her past. What they found made the story even darker. Back in 1986, when Amy Bishop was a teenager in Massachusetts, her younger brother, Seth, died from a shotgun blast in their home. She fired the gun. The official story for years was that it had been an accident, a terrible, tragic misfire. No charges, no trial. But after the Huntsville shooting, that accident didn't look so simple anymore. Old reports suggested that the investigation back then had been sloppy, that she had left the house with the shotgun, that there had been more to the story than anyone wanted to admit. Decades later, surrounded by the bodies of her colleagues in Alabama, that earlier shooting suddenly looked like a possible first chapter. In the Huntsville case, there was no room left for doubt. Amy Bishop eventually pled guilty to capital murder and attempted murder, avoiding the death penalty but guaranteeing she would spend the rest of her life in prison. The image of her standing in that conference room, calmly turning on the very people who had worked beside her, is hard to shake. She wasn't an outsider breaking into the building with a weapon. She was on the inside, badged, employed, trusted enough to sit down in a small room with a handful of other professors and talk about the department's future. And in an instant, she tried to erase theirs. For her students, the shock ran deep. The woman who had lectured them on biology, on the fragility and complexity of life, had walked into a mundane meeting and decided some lives didn't matter anymore. The phrase school shooting usually makes people think of teenagers, angry boys, high schools. Amy Bishop forced the world to remember that violence in education doesn't always come from the bottom of the hierarchy. Sometimes it comes from the top, from the person in the white coat, from the person with the doctorate, from the person everyone else in the room calls professor. 10 women, 10 different classrooms, different countries, different ages, different subjects. But when you strip away the details, the same pattern keeps appearing like a bloodstain that won't wash out. A position of trust, a child or a colleague who believes they're safe, and a woman who decides that her desires, her rage, or her fantasies matter more than anyone else's life. Pamela Smart used teenagers like weapons. Mary Kay Letourneau wrapped a 12-year-old in a story she called Love and refused to let go, even from prison. Brittany Zamora turned a 6th-grade classroom and a 13-year-old's phone into her private playground. Deborah Lefebvre smirked her way through a case the media treated like a scandal, instead of what it really was, the rape of a 14-year-old. Christine McCallum didn't just cross the line once, she erased it, over and over, until there were hundreds of encounters with the same boy. Candice Barber sent explicit photos to a 15-year-old and then tried to scare him into silence when the guilt finally caught up to him. Erin McLean pulled a 16-year-old into her marriage so deeply that her husband ended up dying in the street. Jennifer Fichter multiplied the damage, passing from one student to another like their hearts and bodies were disposable. And then there are the ones who didn't bother to hide behind romance. Laurie Dan walked into a classroom with a gun and turned a room of 2nd graders into targets. Amy Bishop sat calmly in a faculty meeting before deciding which of her colleagues got to keep breathing. Different motives, different methods, same betrayal. We grow up with this idea that teacher and safe belong in the same sentence. For most people, that's true. Most teachers do exactly what they're supposed to do: protect, guide, care, and send kids home alive and unbroken. But these cases force an uncomfortable question. What happens when the person at the front of the room is the one parents should fear the most? Look at how each of these women got close to their victims. They didn't need masks or weapons to get in. They had keys, lesson plans, authority. They had the benefit of every parent who has ever said, "You can trust your teacher." They used that trust like a crowbar. They pried open the cracks in a child's confidence. They slipped into the spaces between colleagues. They took advantage of systems that assume a woman with a smile and a degree couldn't possibly be a predator. Again and again, the first warning sign wasn't a crime. It was something smaller: a teacher who spends too much time alone with one student. Messages that go from professional to personal. A staff member who seems to live at the edge of a breakdown, but no one wants to make a scene by confronting them. Every time someone looked the other way, the damage got worse. Behind every headline, there are people who cannot go back. Kids who have to reconcile the fact that their first experience of love was actually abuse. Parents who have to live with the knowledge that they delivered their children straight into the arms of their abuser and even thanked them. Families planning funerals instead of graduations. These women are rare. But rare is cold comfort if the one standing in front of your child is the exception. It's easy to tell yourself you'd see it, that you'd spot the danger, that your instincts would scream. The truth is more terrifying. In every one of these stories, someone thought the same thing, and they were wrong. So the next time you walk into a school for a parents' evening, or you see a smiling face on a staff directory, remember this: evil doesn't always look like a monster in a mask. Sometimes it looks like a favorite teacher, and sometimes the person who walks into the classroom isn't there to protect the students at all. They're there because a school is the perfect place to find them. You've just listened to the stories of 10 women who stood where parents are told to relax. At the front of the classroom, in the hallway with a lanyard and an ID badge, behind a desk piled with textbooks and lesson plans. Don't worry, we say. They're with a teacher. For most kids, that sentence is still true. For the victims in these cases, it was the beginning of the nightmare. Some of these women used children as weapons. Some used them as substitutes for their own broken relationships. Some used bullets instead of words. But they all did the same thing. They took the word teacher and dragged it through blood, secrets, and lies. Pamela Smart turned a 15-year-old into an executioner. Mary Kay Letourneau turned a 6th grader into a husband and called it destiny. Brittany Zamora turned a 13-year-old's phone into a doorway her victim will never fully close. Deborah Lefebvre taught the world that if a predator looks good enough on camera, people start asking the wrong questions. Christine McCallum and Jennifer Fichter turned extended abuse into something routine. Not a moment, but a schedule. Candice Barber and Erin McLean showed how far a teacher will go to keep a boy under her control, even when it tears families apart. That ended with the student shot dead outside the family home. And Laurie Dan and Amy Bishop proved that sometimes the woman in charge doesn't want your love, your attention, or your obedience. She wants your body on the floor. If you made it all the way to this point, you're not just here for shock value. You're here because you understand that behind every one of these names are real victims, real parents, and real classrooms that will never feel the same again. These aren't horror movies. They're not scripts. They're real people, real kids who had to sit in those desks, real mothers and fathers who had to answer calls they will never forget, real families who had to stand over real graves because someone in authority decided their urges were more important than any child's life. I want you to think about which case stuck with you the most. Was it the man executed in his own living room by teenagers? The 12-year-old who became a father before he even finished middle school? The kids in that 2nd grade classroom watching a woman open fire? Or the professors in a quiet meeting room who never thought the danger would come from the person sitting at the table with them? Whichever one you can't shake. Remember it the next time someone tries to tell you that abuse always has a certain look. It doesn't. It has a pattern: power, opportunity, secrecy. And tonight, we've seen exactly what happens when those 3 things fall into the wrong hands. You've just spent over an hour sitting with these stories. If you want more long, detailed documentaries that don't cut away from the uncomfortable parts, here's how you can help keep this going. First, if you haven't already, like a video. It tells the algorithm there are people who still want full stories, not just 30-second clips. Second, Make sure you're subscribed to Crime Uncovered, with notifications turned on, so you don't miss the next deep dive into true crime. Third, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments which teacher's case disturbed you the most, and why. Was it the ones who pretended it was love? The ones who played favorites until those favorites lost their childhoods? Or the ones who walked into schools with guns and never planned to walk out? And finally, if you're watching this late at night, on your phone, on your TV, wherever you are, you already know what I'm going to ask. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? Put it in the comments so I can see who stayed with this until the end. These are real people, real victims, real classrooms that will never be the same. This is Crime Uncovered. Stay safe, stay aware, and never forget that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one holding the lesson plan.